In 1954, Guatemala's elected government seized unused land from an American banana company and promised compensation based on the value that company had reported for taxes. The number had seemed perfectly acceptable when it reduced the tax bill. Once the government used it to calculate payment, the company suddenly called it unfair. Carlos Castillo Armas was introduced as the leader of a liberation army. Newspapers described his forces as if they represented a broad national uprising. Radio broadcasts claimed that towns were falling, military units were defecting, and the government was losing control across the country. Castillo Armas entered Guatemala City not as the commander of an army that had conquered the nation, but as the beneficiary of a government that had broken from within. The invasion succeeded because the military believed Washington would not allow Arbenz to survive. The operation had achieved its immediate objective. A democratically elected president was gone, the reform movement had been defeated, and the United States could publicly describe the result as liberation. But the people of Guatemala were about to discover what that word actually meant. Castillo Armas moved quickly to dismantle the reforms that had threatened Guatemala's traditional power structure. Decree 900 was reversed, land distributed under Arbenz was reclaimed, and many rural families lost the property they had only recently received. United Fruit recovered much of the land affected by the reform. Large landowners regained confidence, while unions, peasant organizations, and political groups associated with the previous government faced surveillance, intimidation, and legal restrictions. The new regime created lists of suspected communists and political opponents. Thousands of names were recorded, not because every person belonged to a revolutionary organization, but because anti-communist policy now became a tool for removing anyone considered dangerous to the new order. Labor leaders were arrested or forced into exile. Political parties were banned. Independent newspapers faced pressure. The democratic space that had opened after 1944 narrowed rapidly, and peaceful reform became far more difficult. Guatemala did not fall into full civil war immediately. The armed conflict began in 1960, 6 years after the coup. That distinction matters because the violence that followed had multiple causes, including military repression, deep land inequality, regional Cold War tensions, and the rise of armed insurgent movements. But the coup changed the political environment in which those conflicts developed. It showed reformers that an elected government could be removed when its policies threatened powerful domestic and foreign interests. It also taught the military that Washington would support anti-communist stability over democratic procedure. For many on the left, the lesson was devastating. If elections, legislation, and legal reform could be overturned through covert intervention, then peaceful political change no longer looked reliable. Some activists eventually concluded that armed struggle was the only remaining path, but the public story left out the machinery operating behind it. The CIA had trained the exiles, supplied weapons, coordinated propaganda, and cultivated contacts inside Guatemala's military. American officials were not merely observing a rebellion. They were helping manufacture the conditions that made one appear unstoppable. The Guatemalan military reached the opposite conclusion. Officers learned that almost any opposition could be described as communist, and that this label could justify extraordinary force. Over time, counterinsurgency became not only a military strategy, but a system of political control. The civil war that followed lasted 36 years. Government forces, paramilitary groups, and insurgents all committed violence, but civilians carried the greatest burden. Indigenous Maya communities were especially vulnerable because they were often treated as natural supporters of the rebellion. By the time peace agreements were signed in 1996, roughly 200,000 people had been killed or disappeared. Most were civilians, and the overwhelming majority of documented violations were attributed to state forces and allied groups. It would be dishonest to claim that one CIA operation directly caused every death that followed. History rarely offers a chain that simple. Yet it would be equally dishonest to treat 1,954 as an isolated event with no connection to the system that came after it. The coup removed an elected government, reversed land reform, strengthened military authority, and closed much of the legal space for opposition. It did not create every later conflict, but it helped build the political structure in which those conflicts became catastrophic. Washington celebrated a fast, inexpensive Cold War victory. Guatemala inherited decades of repression, fear, and bloodshed. That is the real cost, hidden behind the word liberation. Calling the 1954 operation a banana coup captures something important. United Fruit had clear financial interests. The land reform threatened its holdings, and the company had enough political access to make its case heard in Washington. But that phrase can also make the story sound too simple. The CIA had considered removing Árbenz before the company faced its largest land losses. American officials were already searching for signs of communist expansion in Central America. The Guatemalan Labor Party had real influence in unions and peasant organizations. Some of its members helped advance the land reform. That influence mattered, but it did not prove that Guatemala had become a Soviet puppet or that Árbenz was taking orders from Moscow. This did not mean communist influence was imaginary. Guatemala had a legal communist party, and several of its members gained influence within labor organizations and the land reform movement. But political influence was transformed into something far larger, a supposed Soviet foothold, threatening the entire Western Hemisphere. Domestic actors also shaped the outcome. Landowners feared redistribution. Military officers feared civilian militias and political instability. Regional governments feared revolutionary movements spreading across their borders. The coup worked because several groups wanted Árbenz removed for different reasons. United Fruit did not secretly control every decision in Washington. The CIA, the Eisenhower administration, Guatemala's military, local elites, and anti-communist governments all acted according to their own interests. Their motives overlapped, and that overlap made intervention easier to justify. The first lesson is that private interests can become national security interests when powerful institutions describe them that way. A land dispute can become a geopolitical threat once corporate loss, ideological fear, and military strategy are placed inside the same political frame. The second lesson is that propaganda does not need to invent everything. It only needs to select one part of reality, magnify it, and remove the context around it. Guatemala had communists. What the campaign erased was the difference between communist participation and communist control. The third lesson is that a quick, tactical victory can create a strategic disaster. PBSUCCESS removed Árbenz at relatively low immediate cost, but it damaged American credibility in Latin America and helped convince future reformers that Washington would tolerate democracy only when the results remained acceptable. History becomes useless when it is reduced to one villain, one company, or one ideology. United Fruit mattered. The CIA mattered. Cold War fear mattered. Guatemala's unequal land system mattered. So did the choices of officers, politicians, landowners, activists, and foreign governments. The United States did not overthrow Guatemala simply because Americans loved bananas. It did so because corporate power, Cold War fear, and deep inequality pointed Washington toward the same solution. Remove the government. Call the operation liberation. Leave Guatemala to live with the consequences. That distinction mattered. A country attempting domestic reform was described as an enemy outpost. A covert operation was presented as a popular revolution. And a foreign-backed regime change was packaged for the American public as the spontaneous liberation of Guatemala by its own people. If that uprising was truly national, why did it require secret funding, hired pilots, psychological warfare, and a radio station broadcasting victories that had not happened? Guatemala entered the 20th century with fertile soil, valuable exports, and enormous agricultural potential. Yet much of that wealth rested on a deeply unequal system. A tiny elite controlled most of the productive land, while millions of rural families survived on small plots, seasonal labor, and debt. For many indigenous Maya communities, land was not simply property, it was the foundation of food, identity, and survival. But generations of dispossession had pushed families onto less fertile ground, while large estates held vast areas that were either underused or left completely idle. Under President Jorge Ubico, the government protected plantation owners and foreign investors with ruthless efficiency. Labor laws favored employers, unions were restricted, and rural workers could be forced into exhausting service through systems that linked debt, policing, and agricultural labor. Ubico's government welcomed American companies, especially United Fruit. The company received valuable concessions, favorable contracts, and access to infrastructure that ordinary Guatemalans could never obtain. It did not need to control every acre of the country. It only needed control over the parts that moved wealth. The result was a national economy built to export coffee, bananas, and other crops, while much of the rural population remained poor, landless, and politically powerless. Guatemala produced wealth, but the people doing the hardest work owned very little of it. What began as a dispute over idle farmland soon reached Washington. United Fruit Company warned that Guatemala's reforms threatened American property and regional stability. At the same time, U.S. officials were already watching President Jacobo Árbenz through the darkest lens of the Cold War, convinced that communist influence was spreading toward America's doorstep. This was the contradiction at the heart of the country. Guatemala was not poor because it lacked resources. It was poor because control over those resources was concentrated in very few hands. By 1944, that system had created enough resentment to become unstable. Students, teachers, workers, young officers, and members of the middle class began demanding something that had long seemed impossible. They wanted a government that answered to Guatemala, not to a dictator, a landed elite, or a foreign corporation. In 1944, Guatemala's political order finally cracked. After years of authoritarian rule, protests led by students, teachers, workers, and reform-minded officers forced Jorge Ubico from power. What followed became known as the 10 Years of Spring, a brief democratic experiment in a country accustomed to dictatorship. Juan José Arevalo became president in 1945 after one of Guatemala's first broadly competitive elections. His government expanded civil rights, recognized labor protections, and promoted what he called spiritual socialism, a reformist vision that rejected both dictatorship and Soviet-style communism. These changes alarmed plantation owners, military conservatives, and foreign businesses. Workers organized more freely. Unions gained legal protection. The state began acting less like a guard for elite property and more like an institution expected to answer to ordinary citizens. Jacobo Árbenz emerged from the generation of young officers who had helped overthrow the old regime. Elected president in 1950, he took office the following year with a larger ambition. He wanted to transform Guatemala from a dependent agricultural economy into a modern, independent, capitalist nation. Árbenz believed political democracy could not survive without economic reform. Most rural families had little or no usable land, while large estates controlled huge areas that remained uncultivated. To him, this was not only a social injustice, it was an obstacle to national development. His program aimed to increase agricultural production, expand the domestic market, and reduce Guatemala's dependence on foreign monopolies. He supported new infrastructure, including transportation and energy projects designed to compete with private companies that dominated key parts of the economy. Communists did participate in labor organizations and supported Árbenz's reforms. Their influence was real, but Guatemala was not governed as a Soviet satellite. Árbenz was pursuing a nationalist development program through elections, legislation, and private property rules. Within months, the CIA was training exiles, supplying weapons, building a secret radio network, and organizing a psychological warfare campaign. The objective was not simply to defeat Guatemala's army. It was to convince soldiers, civilians, and political leaders that an overwhelming rebellion was already closing in. The policy that would define his presidency was not a military alliance or a revolutionary seizure of industry. It was a land reform law aimed at unused portions of large private estates. And one company owned more unused land than almost anyone else. United Fruit Company was not merely a business selling bananas. In Guatemala, it operated more like a private system of power. It owned enormous stretches of land, controlled transportation routes, influenced port access, and held concessions that gave it advantages few local companies could ever match. Its strength came from vertical integration. United Fruit did not just grow bananas. It controlled the plantations, the railways that moved crops, the ports that loaded them, and the ships that carried them to American markets. Every stage of the supply chain reinforced the next. That control gave the company leverage far beyond agriculture. A government that challenged its landholdings risked disrupting exports. A competitor that needed access to rail or port infrastructure entered a system already shaped by United Fruit's interests. The company did not own Guatemala, but it occupied critical pressure points inside the economy. Guatemalans called the company El Pulpo, the octopus. The nickname captured how its influence seemed to extend in every direction. Land, shipping, transportation, labor, and political access were connected by the same corporate network, with each arm protecting the others. Much of United Fruit's land was not under active cultivation. Some of it served as a reserve for future expansion. Some created a buffer against disease. Some simply prevented competitors from gaining access to territory near company operations. From the company's perspective, unused land still had strategic value. From the perspective of landless farmers, the situation looked very different. Families struggled to grow enough food, while a foreign corporation held vast properties that produced nothing. To them, unused acreage was not a corporate safeguard. It was a symbol of a system designed to protect ownership over human need. When Árbenz introduced land reform, United Fruit faced a threat unlike a labor strike or tax dispute. The government was challenging the principle that a company could hold large areas indefinitely while surrounding communities lacked usable land. The conflict was no longer about bananas alone. It was about who had the right to decide how Guatemala's land would be used. The rebel force was small. Its military victories were limited. But radio broadcasts announced imaginary advances, hired pilots, dropped bombs, and rumors traveled faster than facts. Guatemala's officers began to fear that resisting the invasion could bring direct American intervention against a country that had no realistic chance of winning. And the answer would depend on a law called Decree 900. In June 1952, the Árbenz government passed Decree 900, one of the most controversial laws in Guatemalan history. Its purpose was not to abolish private property. It was designed to redistribute uncultivated portions of large estates while leaving productive farms and smaller properties largely untouched. The law targeted idle land on major holdings above a defined size. Owners would receive government bonds rather than immediate cash. Those bonds carried interest and were scheduled to mature over 25 years, turning land reform into a legal transfer rather than a simple seizure. Compensation was calculated using the value that landowners had previously declared for tax purposes. This detail would become explosive. For years, declaring a lower value had reduced property taxes. Now the same figures would determine how much the government paid when unused acreage was taken. For Árbenz, the reform was both social and economic. Landless families could produce food, earn income, and participate in the domestic market. Higher rural purchasing power could create demand for Guatemalan goods, helping the country move beyond an economy dependent on plantations and exports. The government argued that idle land was holding national development hostage. Vast estates remained legally protected, while rural communities lacked enough ground to survive. Decree 900 attempted to place unused property into production without eliminating privately owned agriculture or nationalizing the entire farming sector. Opponents saw something far more dangerous. Large landowners argued that the reform weakened property rights and gave local committees too much authority. They feared that communist organizers within unions and peasant groups could use the law to build political power across the countryside. Those fears were not entirely invented. Members of the Guatemalan Labor Party strongly supported the reform, and some gained influence in organizations responsible for carrying it out. There were also local disputes, unauthorized land occupations, and cases where enforcement became chaotic or politically charged. But Decree 900 was not a Soviet order imposed from abroad. It was legislation passed by a Guatemalan government attempting to solve a domestic crisis through legal redistribution, compensation, and private farming. The central argument was not whether property should exist, but whether unused property carried responsibilities. That question became unavoidable when the government applied the law to United Fruit. The company would be compensated according to its own declared land values, and the numbers hidden inside years of tax records were about to become an international crisis. President Árbenz resigned. The land reform was dismantled. United Fruit recovered much of what it had lost. Washington presented the outcome as a victory for freedom over communism, while Guatemala entered a new era of repression, military power, and political violence. United Fruit had spent years reporting low land values for tax purposes. As long as those figures reduced the company's tax burden, they seemed perfectly acceptable. But when Guatemala used the same numbers to calculate compensation, the company argued that its property was worth far more. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. A value that had been useful on a tax form suddenly became unacceptable in a government bond. Guatemala claimed it was simply applying the law consistently. United Fruit insisted the payment failed to reflect the real market value of the land. The dispute quickly moved beyond Guatemala's courts and ministries. United Fruit appealed to Washington, presenting the expropriation as an attack on American property. U.S. officials pressured the Arbenz government to provide far greater compensation than the amount based on the company's own declaration. This did not automatically prove that United Fruit had broken tax law. The records showed a conflict between declared value and claimed value, but the legal meaning was more complicated. What mattered politically was that the company now demanded protection from the consequences of its earlier filings. For ordinary Guatemalans, the case exposed a larger imbalance. A foreign corporation could benefit from low valuations for years, then use diplomatic pressure when those same valuations worked against it. A domestic land dispute had become an international confrontation because the owner was powerful enough to reach Washington. But the banana company was only one part of the story. The CIA had already considered removing Arbenz before United Fruit faced its largest land expropriations. To understand why the United States chose regime change, we have to leave the tax records behind and enter the fear-driven logic of the Cold War. By the early 1950s, Washington saw the world through a narrow and increasingly fearful Cold War lens. The Soviet Union had tested an atomic bomb. China had become communist. American troops had fought in Korea. Every political crisis seemed capable of becoming another front in a global struggle. Guatemala looked small on the map, but its location mattered. It sat in the Western Hemisphere, close to the Panama Canal, and within a region the United States had long treated as strategically sensitive. To American officials, even limited communist influence there appeared dangerously close to home. The Guatemalan Labor Party was legal, organized, and active in unions and peasant movements. Its membership was relatively small, but several party figures gained influence around the Arbenz government and strongly supported land reform. Washington focused intensely on that influence, often treating political access as evidence of foreign control. Yet there was little proof that Jacobo Árbenz was taking direct orders from Moscow. His program was nationalist, not Soviet. He wanted roads, domestic industry, agricultural reform, and greater economic independence. But in the climate of the time, an independent government challenging American business interests could easily be labeled communist. So, decide where you stand. If the land of a country should serve its own people before a foreign corporation, comment one word: land. The distinction became even harder to preserve because anti-communism and corporate interests pointed toward the same target. United Fruit feared losing land and influence. The Eisenhower administration feared a hostile political model spreading through Central America. different motives began producing the same policy recommendation. CIA planning had also started before United Fruit suffered its largest land seizures. An earlier operation, known as PB Fortune, explored ways to support Arbenz's opponents. That timing matters because it proves the coup cannot honestly be explained as a simple corporate response to one compensation dispute. But it also does not erase United Fruit's role. The company helped frame Guatemala as a threat, pressed its case in Washington, and benefited from a political environment already searching for evidence of communist expansion. Corporate pressure did not create Cold War fear, but it gave that fear a profitable direction. By 1953, Washington had stopped asking whether Guatemala should be contained. Officials were beginning to plan how its elected government could be removed without making American responsibility obvious. United Fruit did not control the United States government, but it understood how power moved through Washington. The company had access to lawyers, lobbyists, public relations experts, journalists, and officials who could transform a private business dispute into a national political concern. Its message was simple and effective. Guatemala was not merely redistributing unused land. It was attacking American property, weakening private enterprise, and creating an opening for communist influence in the Western Hemisphere. Each claim reinforced the others until economics and national security became almost impossible to separate. The company also benefited from powerful connections. Senior American officials moved through the same legal, financial, and political circles as United Fruit. These relationships did not prove that Washington acted only on corporate orders, but they ensured the company's arguments reached people capable of shaping foreign policy. At the same time, the Eisenhower administration had its own reasons for hostility toward Arbenz. Officials feared communist expansion, distrusted neutral nationalism, and believed weak governments could become Soviet footholds. United Fruit did not invent those fears. It helped attach them to a specific country and a specific target. This overlap made the coming intervention more dangerous. Corporate executives wanted protection for land, contracts, and infrastructure. American strategists wanted a decisive Cold War victory close to home. Different institutions, driven by different motives, arrived at the same conclusion: Árbenz had to go. Because this coup did not begin with gunfire, by late 1953, Washington was no longer debating whether Guatemala represented a threat. The real discussion had shifted to method. A direct invasion would be difficult to justify, politically costly, and impossible to hide from the world. The preferred solution was quieter. Build an opposition force, isolate the government, frighten the military, flood the country with propaganda. Create enough confusion. Guatemala would collapse from inside, while the United States publicly denied responsibility. That plan became Operation PBSUCCESS. Operation PBSUCCESS was designed as a covert campaign, not a conventional war. The CIA would recruit exiles, train armed units outside Guatemala, spread propaganda, pressure neighboring governments, and build secret contacts inside the Guatemalan military. The operation depended on concealment as much as force. Carlos Castillo Armas became the public face of the effort. A former Guatemalan officer and longtime opponent of Arbenz, he offered Washington something essential: a local leader who could make an American-backed operation look like a domestic rebellion. His force was assembled mainly in Honduras and Nicaragua. The men received weapons, communications equipment, and military instruction. Their numbers were limited, but the plan did not require them to defeat Guatemala's army in open battle. They only had to appear powerful enough to trigger panic. CIA officers also searched for allies inside Guatemala. Military commanders, business leaders, political opponents, and other influential figures were quietly encouraged to believe that Arbenz could not survive. The goal was to isolate the president before the invasion even began. Diplomatic pressure formed another part of the operation. Washington portrayed Guatemala as a dangerous center of communist activity and worked to weaken its international support. Every labor dispute, political appointment, and shipment of weapons was presented as evidence that the crisis was growing. The United States also supported a massive information campaign. Newspapers, pamphlets, speeches, radio programs, and rumors repeated the same message. Guatemala had supposedly fallen under communist control. Resistance was expanding, and the government's collapse was only a matter of time. This was psychological warfare in its clearest form. The CIA did not need every report to be true. It needed enough repetition, confusion, and fear to make people behave as if the reports were true. Once doubt entered the military, the operation could begin feeding on itself. It began with a tax declaration. The secret radio station called the Voice of Liberation became one of the campaign's most important weapons. It broadcast claims about rebel victories, government defeats, and military defections. Many of those reports were exaggerated, premature, or completely invented. By the time Castillo Armas prepared to cross the border, the battlefield had already been shaped. Guatemala faced not only armed opponents, but also diplomatic isolation, internal suspicion, economic pressure, and a growing belief that the United States stood behind the rebellion. The CIA had built something more effective than a large army. It had built the illusion that resistance was already hopeless. On the 18th of June 1954, Carlos Castillo Armas crossed into Guatemala from Honduras with a small rebel force. The invasion looked dramatic on paper, but the reality was far less impressive. His men were scattered, poorly coordinated, and too weak to defeat the Guatemalan army in a conventional campaign. Several rebel units were stopped or delayed. Some attacks failed almost immediately. Government troops still outnumbered the invaders and held the stronger positions. If the conflict had depended only on soldiers, weapons, and territory, Castillo Armas might have remained a minor threat on the border. But the real offensive was taking place through radios, rumors, and fear. The Voice of Liberation reported rebel columns advancing across the country, towns rising against the government, and military units switching sides. Many of these claims were exaggerated, premature, or completely false. The broadcasts were designed to sound local and spontaneous. Listeners heard urgent reports, battlefield updates, and appeals to soldiers. The station created the impression that a national uprising was spreading faster than the government could control it, even when rebel forces had made little progress. CIA-backed pilots added another layer of pressure. Aircraft dropped bombs and attacked selected targets, including military sites and transportation routes. The physical damage was limited compared with a full-scale air campaign, but the psychological effect was much larger than the number of planes suggested. Every explosion carried an unspoken message. The rebels might be small, but the power behind them was not. Guatemalan officers understood that the United States could increase its support at any moment. They began asking whether defending Arbenz might invite a much larger American intervention. Most Americans who heard about Guatemala in 1954 were given a simple story. A small Central American nation had fallen under communist influence, and a patriotic resistance movement had risen to save it. Washington presented the collapse of President Jacobo Árbenz as a victory for freedom. Rumors moved through the capital faster than verified information. Rebel armies were said to be approaching from several directions. Government units were supposedly collapsing. Officials could not easily determine which reports were real, and uncertainty became a weapon more effective than accurate intelligence. Arbenz still commanded the larger military force, but numbers were becoming less important than confidence. Officers hesitated. Political allies became nervous. Civilians feared bombing and invasion. The government was not losing every battle, but it was losing control over how the war was understood. Operation PBSUCCSS succeeded because it turned weakness into the appearance of strength. Castillo Armas did not need to conquer Guatemala City. He only needed the army, the government, and the public to believe that resistance would bring disaster. By the final days of June, that belief had reached the men who would decide Arbenz's fate. Arbenz still controlled the larger army, but control on paper no longer meant loyalty in practice. Senior officers feared that the rebellion was only the opening stage of a wider American intervention. They began to doubt whether the president could protect the country or even protect them. Árbenz considered distributing weapons to workers, unions, and peasant organizations willing to defend the government. To him, civilian resistance offered a way to compensate for military hesitation. To many officers, however, arming civilians threatened the army's authority and risked creating a revolutionary force beyond their control. That fear became decisive. The officer corps was not simply choosing between Árbenz and Castillo Armas. It was choosing between an uncertain president, an armed popular movement, and the possibility of direct confrontation with the United States. From their perspective, every option carried danger. CIA contacts inside the military reinforced the belief that Árbenz had become isolated. Officers were encouraged to see his removal as the only way to prevent escalation. The rebel force remained weak, but the political pressure surrounding it made continued resistance appear reckless. On the 27th of June 1954, Jacobo Árbenz announced his resignation in a radio address. He condemned the foreign-backed campaign against his government and argued that he was stepping down to prevent further destruction. His departure did not follow a decisive military defeat. It followed the collapse of confidence around him. After Árbenz resigned, power did not pass smoothly to Castillo Armas. A series of military juntas emerged, each competing for control. American diplomats and intelligence officers worked behind the scenes to shape the outcome and ensure that the man selected by the CIA eventually reached the presidency.